couple of other things written by O'Connor we should mention. One of those is her collected correspondence. It's called The Habit of Being. It was edited and put together posthumously, as were her public lectures. They were edited and compiled posthumously into a book called Mystery and Manners. Her correspondence is called The Habit of Being. And you find in those essays, you find in that correspondence, well, you find a lot. You certainly find a lot of insight into her stories, but you will find, and this is important, that she reinforces this basic theme in her work, which is our need for self-knowledge, our desperate need to see ourselves as we are. And she also argues across the board that we are in need of we're certainly in need of grace, but we're in need of a kind of a violent grace because of our resistance to self-knowledge. So this is a theme that we come back to over and over as we talk about her work, and we'll see it in both of the stories that we talk about. Now, having said that, there's another conspicuous theme in her stories, and this one is more philosophical. And that is her concern with what we call the doctrine of nihilism. The philosopher most prominent who explained this, who articulated the doctrine of nihilism, was Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century. And this got O'Connor's attention. And she has some very interesting things to say about this. And although she doesn't deal with this in all of her stories, she does in several things that she writes. And when she deals with it, it's in a very incisive, it's a very important and very interesting way. So if you wanted to read two of her pieces of literature that deal with the theme, one would be her short story, Good Country People, which we'll be talking about. The other would be her first novel, Wise Blood. We don't have the opportunity to talk about that in this series, but that's at the center of her novel. At the same time, and we can't say this enough, she's also dealing with the problem, the need for self-knowledge. So at this point, we ought to take a step back just for a few minutes and talk about Friedrich Nietzsche, talk about nihilism, and the principal points there to nihilism, how O'Connor understood that, and how she responded to it in her literature, and secondarily in her essays and in her correspondence. So Nietzsche's most famous, or perhaps most notorious phrase, which appears, I think it's 3 times in his philosophical canon, it's the phrase, God is dead. And probably the most dramatic way in which that appears is in his philosophical novel, Thus Spake Zarathustra. And it occurs when the protagonist of the novel, Zarathustra, who is an antichrist figure, and Zarathustra goes to the top of a mountain, and he spends some time there in the same way that Christ had spent time in the desert. And during that time, he comes to an understanding, and he comes to a point when he says, I am full of myself, I'm full of information, full of knowledge, and I've got to tell people about that. So he becomes a kind of an evangelist, but it's a kind of an anti-evangelist. He's a kind of an antichrist. In fact, one of Nietzsche's books is entitled The Antichrist. The others, we've already mentioned Thus Spake Zarathustra, would be Beyond Good and Evil, The Will to Power. His first work is called The Birth of Tragedy. There are others, but you'll get a long way if you were to take a look at those particular books. So there, Zarathustra is coming down from the mountain. He passes a monastery, and he has a quick exchange with the monk. And at the end of that, they're just exchanging pleasantries. And at the end of that exchange, the monk says to Zarathustra, well, something like, God bless you on your way. And Zarathustra doesn't respond. He continues to walk, but he thinks to himself, doesn't he know, hasn't he heard that God is dead? So what does Nietzsche mean by this? He means that our reliance on traditional religion is, in a sense, dead. That time in human history is coming to a close. Now, it's important to reflect that if he's able to say that God is dead, it also means, as Nietzsche explains, that we, in a sense, created God. We created him because we needed religion. We needed a God. But we've come to a point in human evolution where we need to leave that behind if we're going to continue to progress. Nietzsche also means, though, that all that we have relied on in terms of philosophy, ethics, all of that is coming to an end as well. Now, your reaction to that might be, well, what a crazy idea. But in a sense, Nietzsche was right, at least insofar as, for example, the Enlightenment tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, its dominance over Western civilization. He foresaw that those traditions were losing their grip, they were losing their influence. And I think we'd have to say that looking at the 20th century, late 20th century, and now into the 21st century, that his prediction, his prophecy has come true. And so people, they talk about this whole phase of history using the term modernity, but people are also talking about living in a post-Christian era. And we're even going so far as to say that we're living now in a postmodern era. We've gone beyond this period of history, which consisted of our reliance on religion and then the termination of the influence of that in Western civilization. And we are now entering into an era that's called postmodernity. And what that means is a matter of opinion. It's a matter of argument. The one thing that people seem to share is that we are creating something new at this point. Everything is, in a sense, being born again. So Zarathustra is an anti-Christian figure. He's a kind of an anti-Christ. There's another episode in Thus Spake Zarathustra in which someone brings to Zarathustra an individual in need of healing, someone who's weak, someone who's sickly. And again, it's not hard to see the parallels with the gospel accounts of Christ. And Zarathustra is a bit confused by that. He's not sure what to do with this individual. And so in kind of a comical way, not knowing what to do, he throws the sickly individual over his shoulder and takes him with him for 2 or 3 days. And before too long discovers that the sick individual is beyond sickness. He's now dead. And at that point, Zarathustra says, I understand. I'm not here for the sick. I'm not here to show mercy. I'm not even here to show forgiveness. I'm here for the strong. And we have to let the weak go. Now, Nietzsche also argues that in order to progress into the future, we need to be able to go beyond good and evil. That is, good and evil have been sort of like the boundaries in a football field and a soccer field. And those boundaries have contained our activity. They've assisted us in playing our game. But at this point, we've got to go beyond the game. But in order to do that, we need to erase the boundaries. We need to do away with the rules. And so that's essentially what he means when he says in his book by the same name that we now need to go beyond good and evil. So what's going to govern us philosophically? What's going to govern us morally if we are to go beyond good and evil? Well, Nietzsche describes several individuals. One is called the last man, and these are people who are fading away. And then he talks about the overman, or depending on how it's translated from the German, he may be talking about the Superman. we need to give way to that individual, to the overman, and through the will to power of these individuals, they will recreate everything that we need philosophically, everything we need morally. They will create what's necessary in terms of religion. So we have to rely on the emergence of these individuals to take us to the next step in history. In order to get there, Nietzsche argues we need to hasten the death of God. That is to say, we need to push this process forward because we're in kind of an untenable transition period. And so for that reason, nihilism talks a lot about destruction, the need for destruction. But the important thing that Nietzsche especially adds to that is that we only destroy in order that we might create something new. However, saying this differently, in order to create, we first have to destroy. So if these are some of O'Connor's preoccupations, then how does she respond to these basic ideas of nihilism?